Thank you for watching this video. We would like to start off with a quick thank you to our annual sponsors. Our gold level sponsors, Geronimo Properties, Northmark, AEI Consultants, and EBI Consulting. Our silver level sponsors, St. James Real Estate Advisors and May Property Management. We would also like to mention our charitable partner for 2022, New View Communities, a CDC organization promoting affordable housing in central Massachusetts. To find out how you can become a sponsor of the New England CCIM chapter or to learn more about New View Communities, please feel free to visit our websites. There will be links in the description below. Greetings on behalf of the New England CCIM chapter. I'm Michael Chase, chapter president for 2022. Today is the 8th video for 2022 in our CRE Expert series. We are very pleased to be joined by Karla King, executive vice president of sustainability at AEI Consultants. Karla is a subject matter expert when it comes to ESG, and we are very pleased to have her with us today. Karla, why don't we start off with an introduction? Would you mind telling us a bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much to CCIM for having me. I'm very excited to sit here and talk to you about what's going on with ESG. So Karla King, as you mentioned, I'm EVP of Sustainability at AEI Consultants, focused on working with our clients on energy efficiency, ESG goals, climate resiliency, and all things relative to sustainability and looking into the future for commercial real estate assets. My background is in environmental engineering, and then I went for my law degree with a focus on environmental, and also pursued my master's in engineering management. So really, this has been a great opportunity to apply my educational background as well as my experience both in engineering design as well as consulting, and working with clients on solving problems for the future and helping them set goals and develop a roadmap towards their ESG journey, which can be very different for each client. And it's a little overwhelming, but if we break it down, it really is kind of a good structured approach to understanding the kind of health of the organization from an environmental, social, and governance standpoint.
Great. Well, let's start there. You mentioned environmental, social governance, ESG. Talk to us a little bit more about that. What is ESG for the layperson?
Absolutely. A lot of people can get overwhelmed by it. It's another acronym out in the industry. We love our acronyms, especially in the environmental field, but this really is bringing together, investor concerns relative to three key components to an organization, kind of their environmental impact, their social impact, and then their own governance. To simplify it, I kind of see ESG as almost the Fitbit of kind of health of that organization. It really is taking a lot of the tried and true things that we've been doing for years and just making sure they're getting measured and able to report back on them. So if we think about that in that context, a lot of people have already been doing a lot of the things that are intended to be the outcome of ESG, but now there's really a kind of mechanism and tool and a focus on the metrics and the reporting of those actions. And so trying to break it down to those simple kind of components makes it a lot easier and a little less overwhelming to say like, oh my goodness, what's this new thing? And really it's, rather than focusing in the environmental world on what happened in the past, kind of the sins of the past, ESG is really kind of looking forward. So I see it as a lens, looking forward to focus on our future impact and how we can reduce that impact or positively influence that impact, rather than just reporting on things that have happened in the past and figuring out, forward mitigation measures.
So we talk about ESG. In some ways, it's a new topic for many people. We've seen plenty of podcasts and panels and things on ESG, but how long has ESG actually been around in the industry at this point?
That's a great question. I don't even know if I can answer that question in the formal capacity. And it's much more prominent overseas in Europe. They're well ahead of us here in the U.S., but we're obviously making great strides. But to specify the specific year, I don't know if I can nail that down. But it has definitely been something where the United States is kind of lagging from the ESG standpoint. So we do have some room for improvement and catching up. But the good news is there's lessons learned in other countries that we can, kind of take away from what's been done over there and be able to leverage that here as it applies to the United States and what's going on here.
Okay, so I think the greater point is it isn't something that just came about yesterday or just within the last year. This has been around for a little while. So when we're talking about ESG, I tend to think about it, and I love your input on this. I tend to think about it as affecting different levels in different ways. I think of ESG right now as in a way being driven by large investment groups such as pension funds, and on the investor side, social impact investors, and they're wanting to make sure that their constituents, that they're investing funds in a socially conscious way. So they're kind of driving the bus, and everybody else is kind of reacting to that. So let's start there. At the institutional level, whether that be institutional lenders, REITs, pension funds, equity funds, how are they right now dealing with ESG?
Yeah, I think, I've seen it best summarized. Obviously, everybody's journey is a little bit different, depending on where that driver is coming from, influences how it's impacting your day-to-day and what you're doing about it. So like I say, everyone has their own ESG journey. And kind of own roadmap, quite frankly. You really need to understand your goals. There's other factors that influence the journey too. Where are your assets, location-wise, et cetera. But from that kind of high-level institutional standpoint, investors are concerned about understanding, some key metrics. Where we're seeing it from our role as environmental consultants is, understanding carbon footprint. Being one of them. How do we report that back? We're starting to see a lot of folks take that into consideration from a portfolio-wide standpoint, as well as during the due diligence process, where folks are starting to collect more information than they ever have before. Collecting key pieces of information about the performance of the building, collecting information relative to climate risk, and understanding those aspects of ESG. So the data collection has really ramped up, and everyone's collecting different pieces of information, but it can range from, a checklist of items that they want to collect information on about their commercial real estate assets to kind of more comprehensive, what we're calling kind of an ESG memo, which really looks, somewhere in between a deep dive. It's not quite an energy audit because they're not going to that extent where they're necessarily going to want to identify every single, energy efficiency upgrade, et cetera, but they do want to understand, where does this fall on the spectrum? I've heard one client talk about risk evaluation, where they kind of look at even the borrowers from that standpoint. Is somebody thinking about ESG at all? If the answer is no, they're almost the highest risk. Are they thinking about it, but not necessarily doing anything about it? So yes, they're thinking about it, but they're not doing anything about it. That's that medium. And then the most proactive ones are those who are thinking about it and taking steps towards, mitigation measures or energy efficiency measures. So, big categories that we're seeing are, greenhouse gas emissions, energy use intensity, collecting information relative to, kind of the location and the community and how it's, from walkability scores to bike score, looking at renewable energy. So a lot of different pieces of information are kind of starting to get collected as part of their ESG evaluation and what they need to report back to their key stakeholders.
Is there a value add opportunity with ESG? Sometimes as an investor, you look at a property, an opportunity to either bring a tenant up to market or replace a tenant, or do a lease up or make some capital improvements to make a building more efficient. Are ESG initiatives helping owners and investors add value to their properties?
Yes, and I'm not one to predict the future, but I would suspect that it's only going to get more critical, and you can either say it's a value add, or if you're not doing it, it's going to be a value deduct. So I think the industry is really moving towards this becoming the future norm. But right now, if they're on the forefront of it, if you're somebody who is taking proactive measures to make sure a property is, taking natural hazard mitigation measures into consideration, putting in the energy efficient equipment. So as, regulatory drivers and other drivers, relative to net zero goals start coming into play, you want to, that property would be in compliance and at the forefront. I think the balancing act is the when and how to do those projects or create that value add. And it doesn't necessarily have to be today. I think the most critical part is having a plan in place. So, as an example, one of the clients we were working with is, was kind of creating their capital plan and looking at the 1, 5, 10, 20, 20-year lookout of, when's the end of useful life of this key pieces of equipment, and really starting to integrate some of the ESG resiliency considerations into that long-term planning. You don't necessarily need to replace your equipment today. You need to plan for when you do need to replace that equipment, and understand, either where the regulatory drivers or your investor demands are coming from, so that you have a plan in place to get there, so that nothing is surprising you, or that you're not trying to do these, upgrades in a panic mode when, you need to be in compliance in a few months, and that, there's issues with supply chain and demand on, getting the energy efficient equipment. As it is, those are already challenges. So long-term planning and kind of road mapping your ESG, your journey is really an important step to take sooner rather than later, even if you're not necessarily somebody who has to do an ESG report. Clients, investors, end users are going to start be asking those questions. And kind of to get back to your original question, just about value add and tenant, I think that's also going to be another key aspect. Is, let's say somebody's looking for space and one can kind of report on some key ESG metrics, which could tie into their overall performance, versus a property that doesn't know any of those metrics or can't report on it or isn't doing anything on it. All other things the same, they're likely to go with the one that is able to at least report on the initiatives and understand where they stand today.
Okay. You mentioned some emissions and sustainability standards. Can you touch on any of those that might be happening here locally in the New England area?
Yep, Boston has their BERDO, their kind of energy ordinance in place. They're also moving towards having implementing climate resiliency design standards as well. So Boston is one of the cities that are on the forefront of all of this. Obviously, New York is also on the forefront. New York City, some key kind of East and West Coast cities are really at the forefront of requiring benchmarking, understanding where you stand today. It's the beginning of your journey. You can't really set a roadmap out unless you know where you are today, so you can understand where you need to go and how you can get there. So there are starting to be a lot of regulatory drivers out there, at minimum, to be able to benchmark your property and know, what your use today, how does it compare to similar assets, size, use, et cetera. And be able to at least report on that information.
And what
I think one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest challenges to all of the benchmarking is, navigating, getting utilities depending on the, roles, relationship, tenant, who you're dealing with, who has kind of access to those utilities. So that's one of the biggest challenges we've seen with clients, is making sure they can get access to, or, starting to put leases in place that allow them to get access to utility information if they, don't have whole building meters that they're able to extract the utility data from. So that's one challenge we are seeing with clients who have obligations to report and then need to track down key pieces of information.
And
what were you going to say?
Is BERDO, when is that coming on? Is that 2025? What's the timetable for that?
We're already almost in BERDO 2.0 at this point, is underway and getting approval. So benchmarking has already been implemented and required. Now it's moving towards the net zero goals. Don't quote me on this. I think it's 50% reduction by 2030, and then the ultimate goal is 100% net zero by 2050. But I would want to verify that. But that's generally speaking, I'd say holistically, where a lot of these ordinances are heading is working towards kind of a 50% reduction over the next few years and complete reduction by 2050.
We've talked a lot about, particularly on the environmental and sustainability legs of ESG. When a commercial property owner is looking at improving their overall ESG score, and they might be thinking more of the social impacts, what are the things that kind of move the needle there? Is it a matter of their ownership structure and their corporate governance? Is it the tenant mix? Are there things that they can be doing with their property on the social side or either their property or their organization on the social side to improve their overall ESG?
Yep, absolutely. I think right now what we're seeing a lot of focus on, obviously health and safety aspect of, the social is a piece, but, not everyone controls the operations that happen, and health and safety can be challenging from that standpoint, right? The building itself as a structure versus the operation and the tenants that are happening inside. What I've seen is just a prioritization of again, if we're focusing on the asset component, kind of the commercial real estate asset component of where is this located? What are key community things that tenants or occupants would have access to? Can they access, by bike, walking, transit, or is it all just car? Would they, you think about even electric vehicle from that standpoint, that touches kind of a little bit of everything. If somebody does have to, access it only by car, are there EV charging stations? And starting to think about some things like that. But getting back to the S component, we're seeing a lot of people starting to look at community space. Is there community space at this site? Are there mother's rooms? Are there physical characteristics about this property that would make it more appealing from the S standpoint for either a tenant to be able to ensure that they're hitting some of the key metrics that are associated with S. There's a bigger move when clients are looking at, working with a healthcare client and they're assessing the WELL standard, and there's a lot of alignment between WELL and, especially coming off of the pandemic with the WELL building standard and, a lot of the aspects that are under S and metrics that are under the S of ESG. And so some folks are moving in the direction of like, okay, well, I'm going to design the building to the WELL building standard, or at least starting incorporating some of the aspects of WELL into the property. So we're thinking about air quality, thinking about fitness centers, thinking about, all these different aspects that impact the user's space of that physical asset.
So one moment, the WELL standard, can we touch on that for a moment? What is that?
So WELL is, I'll call it the new lead, but it's a little bit more, it's focused on rather than the environmental impact of the property, it's focused on the tenant experience, the user's experience, or whoever's occupying the space, okay, and kind of their health and safety, their air, water, air quality, water quality, lighting, noise, all of those aspects to make a positive experience. So it is another standard that is out there. What I like about WELL over LEED is that LEED is focused heavily on the design and not on what happens after the design is done and the people are occupying the space. WELL is focused very much on the continued monitoring to ensure that the air quality, the water quality, lighting, noise continue to focus on the tenants that are in the space. And so I think it's a good move. Like I say, I don't think every property needs to move towards meeting that standard, you obviously have to do kind of return on investment type of assessment to figure out if it makes sense for your assets. But I do think that the concept and some of the key metrics that are looked at for well are very good from a alignment with ESG, and to make sure those are being thought about when you're thinking about how space is being used or modifying space, and not just looking at it from a visual design standpoint, but from an occupant standpoint, and how the users are going to experience that space.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Now let's drop down individual investor. Someone who owns maybe a small residential property under 10 units, maybe a commercial property that falls below the BERDO threshold, reporting threshold. They might be looking up and saying, okay, I see ESG, I see these ratings on the S&P 500 companies, I see the institutions talking about it, but how does that in fact, or what should the individual investors be looking at?
I'd say still some of the same things. It's just the degree to which they're looking at them. This is where I think that idea of long-term planning and just knowing what's going on in all the other space around you, to be prepared for, what happens if and when BERDO, decreases that square footage amount. So I think just making plans as you're making plans for a property and going to be making any modifications, just keep these aspects in mind, right? Start thinking about these and building them into capital plans. Don't replace equipment with the same equipment just because it's worked for the past 20 years. Evaluate whether it makes sense to put in the more energy efficient equipment, because in the long term, that's probably the direction that, you're either going to need to, or in order to appeal, tenants. So just making smart decisions. It's not to say you have to, put in the most energy efficient equipment in, or, go to any extreme that would be a financial burden on, your financial position with, smaller assets. But taking those things into consideration and evaluating them, and doing kind of that feasibility assessment to understand, what can you do that makes sense, maybe even just from a return on investment standpoint, not even from an ESG standpoint, but it might make good business sense to put in more, water efficient or energy efficient equipment. So I think just having that at the, like I say, as this lens of planning, as you're looking at the asset, making decisions, to always take into consideration, things that are impacting energy, things that are impacting water, the social aspect. It's a little bit more challenging without always knowing, who's your future tenant, all of that. But I'd say really focus on the things that are easier to measure and control, that you actually can influence, and build those into your roadmap or your capital plan.
Great. Because I think of Boston as being one of those major market cities that attracts a lot of foreign capital. And I think you mentioned earlier on that the United States is somewhat behind, particularly European countries, when it comes to ESG initiatives. So even as an individual investor, I imagine, having some of these thoughts in mind could certainly help market my property to that potential foreign investor. Even if they're coming over and looking at a 6-unit apartment in Cambridge, they're probably used to seeing certain environmental standards in their own country, and seeking those types of properties or those types of improvements here.
Absolutely. Yep. That's a great point too. Just adding, like you say, that's a little bit on the value add side of appeal to other investors. If you're staying at that at the forefront and able to, again, report, you may not be the most efficient performing building, but if you're able to at least say, hey, here's what we're doing, here's what we're, keeping track of, here's where we stand today, here's our, we're not falling under this regulatory driver, but this is the direction we're moving in. I think it does go really well to that value add play.
So Is there, as we wrap up our conversation, is there anything in particular that you're advising your clients on currently in the ESG space as they're thinking about making plans for either the rest of this year or going into next year?
Yeah, I think underlying and talking with lots of different clients is one, understanding where you stand today. And then the other key piece of that is understanding what are your priorities going forward. It's hard to tackle all of this, and that's where it can feel overwhelming, where there's a lot of aspects to ESG. Certain roles have control over certain aspects of ESG. At the executive level, it's a little daunting, to think about the overall ESG and understanding everything. But anything that you can do in, kind of 2022 is if you can confidently be able to answer simple questions like, what's your carbon footprint? What's your water use? What's your waste? And, that's just on the environmental side. But those are challenging questions to ask, or to answer, to be honest, if you don't have, systems, processes, and mechanisms in place to be able to track those things. That information is not just, in your notebook somewhere. So I think that is a good first step, is kind of understanding where you are today. Then it's really looking at, okay, what's driving your ESG story? Is it an investor? And making sure you understand what are their priorities, what's most important to them from, and then focusing on that, and saying, okay, is it energy reduction? Okay, let's make a plan for that. Let's understand, and not just say, hey, we're going to reduce our energy use by 25%. Make a real plan, like one that how you can accomplish. I kind of use the terrible analogy, again, tying this all to the Fitbit, so to speak, of, ESG health is, it's like setting a goal to run a marathon, and with, not even knowing, how you're going to do it, right? Like, hey, I'm going to run a marathon. I'll figure out how I'm going to do it. Versus like, hey, I'm going to start off with a 5K, and then I'm going to do a 10K. Then I'm going to do a half marathon, and then I might, set a marathon. But don't go for like the most difficult, accomplishment, or set a goal that's very unachievable or unrealistic for your business. I think an important aspect here is everybody's got business challenges and profitability and, other things that are pressuring them from a business standpoint. The whole intent here is to, really demonstrate that, you are doing, as best as you can and making good strides on the ESG standpoint. And you're not going to be able to do that overnight. And so if you can, prioritize, understand where you are today, prioritize what are the key areas that you can influence and make progress towards, and kind of have a plan for that. I think that's the most kind of palpable approach to ESG, and to not get overloaded or overcommit to something. Because I think the worst thing right now, especially with terms like greenwashing out there and things like that, is to commit and put an ESG report out saying, these are all the things I'm going to accomplish, and then be backpedaling to try to figure out how to get there, versus saying, okay, time out. Where am I today? Where can I realistically go? Simple things of, hey, I'm going to make sure I do an energy audit at, 50% of my heaviest energy use assets. And so then I can understand what are realistic things that I can do in those, for those assets within the next 5 years. So kind of set those types of goals rather than, 25% reduction and just, putting it out there. That's what does get challenging about, BERDO and things like that. It's like, okay, yes, we're going to get this, but how? It takes a lot of work, and, there's infrastructure support that needs to come into play.
Right.
And there's a lot of moving parts here. So control what you can, set a plan, and, make it something that's very realistic for your organization and your business. You don't want to overcommit to something. Yeah.
Karla,
Yes, that would be my advice.
Yes, no, thank you. That's great advice. Karla, thank you again for taking the time to chat with us today. And thank you for taking the time to watch this video. You can follow Karla on LinkedIn as well as through the AEI Consultants website. We will include links in the description below. We have a great lineup of speakers continuing to come and speak with us. So we'll be posting more content in the coming weeks. Please like and subscribe below and keep an eye on this channel. Also, feel free to follow us on LinkedIn and other social media platforms. Thank you for viewing.